Some good news and some bad news for Ohio State on the recruiting trail today, as Ohio State lands a commitment from one of its if not its biggest linebacker target, Cincere Johnson, but misses out on one of its top defensive end targets as Luke Wafle commits to USC. Garrick, not going to lie, we recorded a version of this video yesterday thinking we were going to be talking about two Ohio State commitments today because as of Wednesday afternoon, we had gotten word that both Cincere Johnson and Luke Wafle were likely to commit to Ohio State. But in the last 24 hours, things changed. Luke Wafle ends up committing to USC, the school that it appeared before Wednesday that he was probably going to commit to. NIL, new world of recruiting, things can change very fast, and that's certainly what happened here with Luke Wafle.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. Yeah, I'm entering my 5th season covering the team, and I was trying to think, is this the craziest recruitment I've covered? And the other nominees are Jeremiah Smith, which I think this is crazier than that because I long maintained that as long as Brian Hartline and Ryan Day were here, Jeremiah Smith was going to be in Columbus.
Ryan Day did almost faint at the podium.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know if Ryan Day was going to faint at the podium over
Luke Wafle. We don't know. He might have fainted 3 times. That was the only one that we saw. I think that one was crazy to your point because we saw it play out in front of us. Another nominee is Edric Houston because, the Fawn bomb, as is made popular over the past 24 hours and long before that, of course, but he was projected to flip to Alabama on signing day, and then we saw Ryan Day get a call from Edric Houston that said, "Yeah, all right, I'm coming." 10 minutes into his presser, it was a presser that was interrupted twice. Crazy signing day presser, but honestly, I would probably give the edge to Luke Wafle's commitment being the craziest recruitment 24 hours that we've had, and especially going back to 11 Warriors Inside Baseball. Yeah, Dan and I found a quiet place. We were at the Woody Hayes Athletic Center for the 7-on-7 tournament, the last one of the summer. We recorded about 14 minutes just breaking down both what Cincere and Luke bring to the Buckeyes. And we were pretty confident that they were in from everything that was going on and from what we were hearing. And suddenly overnight, just changed like that. Sometimes the bag man is undefeated, as they say. But we're gonna break down both situations. We're gonna start with the good news because I suppose we probably want to talk more about the guy that's actually coming to Ohio State rather than the fun circumstances surrounding the one they missed out on. But Dan, Cincere Johnson, a guy that's long been connected to Ohio State, been recruited by Ohio State for almost longer than 2 years now. Another Glenville standout. They're going to continue the Glenville to Ohio State pipeline that's long bolstered the Buckeyes. And you had a pretty interesting comparison for Cincere Johnson yesterday when we were recording, and someone that happens to be his best friend and mentor.
It's low-hanging fruit, but Arvell Reese really does feel like the comparison here. I mean, you just look at the size, 6'3", 240, a guy who kind of looks like an edge rusher, yet Ohio State's looking at playing middle linebacker. 24/7 actually lists him as an edge rusher now, but Ohio State is recruiting him primarily to play linebacker. Certainly possible that he could be a guy who moves around, especially with Matt Patricia coming in as defensive coordinator. We're expecting to see more of that edge rushing linebacker role in Ohio State's defense. Could Cincere Johnson be a player who could potentially fill that role down the line? It's certainly possible, but it seems like the expectation from Ohio State is this is a guy who's going to be a future Mike linebacker for the Buckeyes, just like Arvell Reese is going to be this year. So it's low-hanging fruit, but it's the obvious comparison. And in this case, I think it's apt of a guy coming from a powerhouse program up there in Cleveland where, it's pretty much been, going back to the days of Troy Smith and Dante Whitner 20 years ago. If you are a top prospect from Glenville, you're expected to end up at Ohio State. And that's what we've seen time and time again. They're still pursuing another player from Glenville, Jameer Perez, defensive tackle, who's currently committed to Florida. We'll see if Ohio State is able to flip him to the Buckeyes. Seems to be some momentum there. But you just look in recent recruiting cycles, whether it's Bryce West, Arvell Reese, Demarion Witten, or now Cincere Johnson. That pipeline, it had been really big in the Jim Tressel years with, guys like Troy Smith and Ted Ginn and Dante Whitner. And then, you saw it again in the Urban Meyer era with guys like Cardale Jones and Marshawn Lattimore, who became stars from Glenville. And now we've seen it really kind of resurge here in the last few years. Certainly going to play a big role on the team this year with Arvell Reese as that starting Mike linebacker, and now bringing in Cincere Johnson significantly increases the likelihood that there's going to be a significant Glenville presence on this Ohio State defense for years to come.
One thing I don't want to see get lost in the shuffle with all the craziness is that how exciting it is that the Buckeyes got Cincere Johnson, because it's almost kind of seemed like a foregone conclusion that they were going to get him. So maybe there wasn't such a, oh my goodness, wow, this is such a great day for Ohio State. Granted, there was the usual fan celebration that there always is after every commit. But, you still got to factor in this is a guy that's ranked as a top 70 recruit in the nation by pretty much every recruiting outlet. This is a guy that is a very high ceiling player, capable of making plays everywhere. I think he's your prototypical Mike linebacker. You can plug him in and play right away. I'd expect him, if he follows the Arvell path, he's going to probably contribute pretty significantly by his second year, I would guess. First year might be a tough ask, just considering how deep that linebacker room is right now, especially with the freshman class they brought in last year. But I just don't necessarily want the events of today, because, they happened right after the other, to overshadow that the Buckeyes are getting a really damn good player in Cincere Johnson.
And this is a guy who was very much at the top of James Laurinaitis' board. I think maybe the only guy that was above him was Tyler Atkinson. And, Tyler Atkinson's a guy who's considered the best linebacker in this 2026 recruiting class. Seems like that one's trending away from Ohio State. There was hope that he would make an official visit this weekend. He's going to be going to Texas instead. So doesn't look very promising right now for Ohio State to land Tyler Atkinson. But with what they have right now, if their linebacker class ends up being Cincere Johnson and CJ Santa, that would be a good, solid class. They'd probably like to add one more piece there. But you look at what they've brought in the last couple years. They got, a guy in Peyton Pierce going into his second year who James Laurinaitis absolutely loves. He's going to be that top backup this year. He'll probably be starting alongside Arvell Reese next year, unless Arvell Reese goes to the NFL. Even if he does, you've got a really good freshman class in this year, led by Riley Pettijohn and TJ Alford, Eli Lee also in there. Now you've got two very highly touted in-state guys that they like a lot in Cincere Johnson and CJ Santa coming in. So I think that James Laurinaitis has done a really good job here in his first couple of recruiting cycles as Ohio State's linebackers coach, really building the future of the program at that position. Like you said, this was a recruitment they were always expected to win, but you still got to go win it. And I think, Alabama was a real contender here. Penn State was a real contender here. Ohio State was always the favorite. That never changed. But I do think that, there was still work that had to be done to beat out those schools. And James Laurinaitis and Ohio State rightfully did that work. Now, if we switch over now to Luke Wafle and the defensive end recruiting, this is a position where Ohio State's had a lot of these tight battles here for guys over the last few years. And so it stings to once again come up short here. Ohio State right now, with only one defensive lineman committed in the 2026 class, that being Kari Wilder from California. And so there's still a lot of work to do for Larry Johnson and Ohio State in this class. Now, specifically to Luke Wafle, I think two things can be true here. I think on one hand, it's clear this is a guy who was at or near the top of Larry Johnson's board, because Ohio State doesn't like getting into NIL bidding wars, period. Sometimes you have to do it in today's era of college football. Like, you got to spend money in recruiting. It's just the way it is. But Ohio State doesn't like getting into just straight up bidding wars for guys. So the fact that they, reportedly really made a push there in those last couple days, ramping up their NIL offer to try to win that battle over USC, over Penn State, that tells you how badly they wanted Luke Wafle, excuse me. And so it stings that they did not ultimately close the deal here. At the same time, I think when Ohio State ups its offer, and then USC upped its offer. You could kind of see the writing on the wall here, but this probably wasn't going to go Ohio State's way, because Ohio State, that's just not the way they operate, where they want to go back and forth, up in their offer, up in their offer. And you hear the numbers that have been thrown out there for Luke Wafle, reportedly over $2 million over 2 years. That's over $1 million for, a player coming in as a freshman. And how all of this is going to work out, we're still kind of figuring that all out when you hear about these numbers, like how much of that's going to be actual revenue sharing money versus how much of that's going to be outside NIL and what counts and whatnot. It's also new, but I don't think either of us really quite knows fully how all that's going to work yet. But the reality is, you talk about where Ohio State is, revenue sharing. They have 18 million basically to revenue share their athletes. That doesn't just include football. That's also men's and women's basketball and women's volleyball. Now, football is going to get a big piece of that pie, but nevertheless, you only have a certain amount of revenue share that you are allowed to share with your athletes. And if you're Ohio State, you got a lot of guys both on your team right now and guys that you're bringing in that you're trying to give a piece of that pie to. And so you can only promise so much to a guy. If it's a Jeremiah Smith or a Caleb Downs, you're probably going to do whatever you have to do in that regard. But everybody else, you got to be a little bit selective here. And, I think some of this in the end may ultimately have come down to USC was a little more desperate to get Luke Wafle than Ohio State was.
Yeah, we had this exact conversation late last night when we were reading the reports from On3 still. Steve Wiltfong, who does a great job covering recruiting. And the numbers being thrown around over, like you said, over 2 years, anywhere from 2.1 to 2.6 million, I think it was. Like you're approaching Bryce Underwood territory. So you're telling me that Ohio State and possibly USC are going to pay, at least from all right, let's do it a different way. Ohio State, like you said, has 18 million to revenue share to split between those 4 sports. And let's just throw out a ballpark number and say football is going to get 14 million of that. So more than 1/14 of the cap is going to be spent on one defensive end that's a freshman and 18 years old. I don't think so. Now, again, I don't know the specifics, and they're not going to break down the specifics for us until they're forced to. Maybe FOIA laws will help. Who knows? But all right, so 250 is coming from this pot, 250 is coming from that pot, 100 is going here, et cetera, and exactly how this whole mega Godfather offer style works. But switching gears a little bit, I mean, I'll do another. You can look at it from 2 ways. On one hand, I understand that every time fans hear about this, that a player didn't pick their school because they got outbid, it sucks. Yeah, it's unfortunate that you get excited about the potential of landing a kid, and then someone just upped the offer, and the illusion has been long gone, but the illusion just keeps going on. And I know for the more traditional college football fans, getting more disillusioned with recruiting, the stuff that I talk to, this situation makes it very difficult for them. And I sympathize with it because, it's supposed to be fun, and sometimes seeing how the sausage is made right in front of you makes it less fun. Now, on the other hand, I completely don't blame the Wafle family at all, or him himself, because if it were my kid and I had 3 to 4 schools bidding on my son, and USC came in, and who knows what Ohio State's final offer was. Maybe it was 900, maybe it was more, who knows. But if, USC was like, all right, Mr. Hodge, we're going to offer, well, I'm a junior already, so let's pretend my future son that doesn't exist is Garrick the Third. But we're going to offer him 1.4 million guaranteed for 2 years. Of course I'm going to take it. Who wouldn't? You're telling me that you're paying him my son that no matter what, for being a good high school football player and for having a very projectable body type? Of course. That's financial security for life. So yeah, that's a situation of both things can be true, and you can't really begrudge the family when you think that they're just doing what's best for them in the long run. But In all actuality, I mean, nobody feels sorry for the national champs. That's just the way it is. No one's going to cry for Ohio State. That the famous 20 million NIL thrown around, even though more teams have been proven to spend more, but that was the most publicized one because Ross Bjork admitted they spent about 20 million on the roster. And Kirby Smart's famous line, "There's no crying on the yacht." So Ohio State's going to have to pick itself up off the floor and switch to its backup plan pretty quickly here.
Yeah, it's NFL free agency light now. I mean, it's you think of the NFL, you can make your pitches based on your team facilities, your coaches, or whatever. But at the end of the day, a lot of times it just comes down to who's going to give you the most money, and that's become a big part of recruiting now. And so I think in this case, it certainly seems like in the end, that's what it ultimately became with Luke Wafle, was which school was going to put its money where its mouth is and was going to make him the biggest offer. And in the end, that was USC. They're certainly throwing a lot of money around. They've got 30 commits right now. They have the number one recruiting class of 2026, just largely based on the sheer volume of commits they have. If Ohio State had beaten USC out for Luke Wafle, maybe we start talking about Ohio State making a push for that number one spot in the recruiting rankings. Instead, USC closed the deal. They open up that gap a little bit. It's going to be interesting to see how sustainable it is for USC to have 30 guys committed by June. And again, if you're giving a little bit of money to everybody, how much of that revenue share next year for USC is just going to be going to your freshman class? It's going to be interesting to see how that all works out. Maybe you can do that if you're USC because you've been a bit down and you don't have as many of your current players you really got to pay to keep. So you have a little bit more money to throw around. Either way, we have seen USC beat Ohio State in a couple big recruitments here in this cycle. Certainly Albert Hill was another big one, the top prospect from the state of Ohio, top cornerback target for Ohio State. He also chose USC over to Buckeyes. So USC certainly trying to make itself relevant in the Big Ten again. We saw last year, starting out in the Big Ten, a very disappointing first season for USC. And I think Lincoln Riley's reputation has taken a hit since he's made this move to USC, as the Trojans have not yet become the national championship contender they're supposed to be. But certainly what they're doing right now on the recruiting trail, they're trying. Lincoln Riley might be looking at it and going, I need a huge recruiting class to save my job because of how disappointing our last couple of seasons has been. And they're certainly doing what they need to do on the recruiting trail right now to try to make that happen. Going back to Ohio State, as you mentioned, Ohio State's got to pick itself up here, and they've got to land some more defensive linemen because, it's been one of the weaker areas, frankly, in recruiting the last couple years has been defensive line, and particularly winning a lot of these battles for top flight defensive linemen, whether that be on the edge or at tackle. So we mentioned Kari Wilder, the one commit Ohio State has right now. Who are some of the other guys right now that Ohio State fans should be watching for as potential guys to fill out that 2026 class?
Well, I guess we'll see how realistic it is by the end of the weekend, but I'm really interested in the high school defensive end tandem coming to Ohio State this weekend in KJ Ford and Landon Barnes. Same school that produced former Ohio State Buckeye Amari Abor. So who knows if they're a package deal or not, and they both visited the spring game at Ohio State together. But I think now that you don't have Luke into the equation, I think those guys look a lot more intriguing. They're both ranked in around the top 150 prospects in the country. They're both guys that could move the needle and give Larry Johnson that win that would, I guess, help. It's not really get the monkey off his back because it's not like he hasn't landed a big fish before. But, he has had his sheer amount of misses, as you've alluded to, Dan. But yeah, I'm definitely going to be watching those guys this weekend. I caught up with Jackson Ford, who just visited Ohio State last week, and I think that he definitely could be a guy that's in play there. We'll see how his official visit goes to Michigan this weekend too, so they might have some stuff to say about that. But if Ohio State really pushes for a guy like that, I think that he could make a nice addition to the class as well. So on the edge, I'm really focused on those three guys for now, but The really big fish that's out there is Carter Meadows, 5-star, also visited last week. National recruiting industry doesn't probably give Ohio State a great shot to land him, but I don't know. I still think they maybe have a little bit better of a shot than people might think. And who knows if they're, it's hard to say what their evaluation is of Meadows compared to, Luke, but if they're clearly willing to spend a decent chunk amount of money on Luke, maybe they will in turn be willing to spend a decent amount on Carter if their evaluations are similar. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But they know, like you said, Dan, they know that they need a big win on the defensive line, and I'd expect they try to get it before the end of the summer.
Yeah, it sounds like Carter Meadows' official visit went well. And, you're talking about that DMV area, where Chase Young came out of, an area that Larry Johnson has typically recruited very hard and has had a lot of success recruiting. So I think Carter Meadows, certainly someone to watch, along with, all those other names you mentioned. Before, Jameer Perez, certainly a guy to watch at defensive tackle too, as Ohio State looks to get another win out of that Glenville pipeline after getting one today with Cincere Johnson. So not quite the day that Ohio State was hoping for, not the double boom day that Ohio State was hoping for, but still plenty of reason for celebration at the Woody Hayes Athletic Center as Ohio State landed one of its top defensive targets in the class, locking in one of the best players in the state of Ohio in Cincere Johnson, a player who has the potential to be a future star for the Buckeyes defense. And as Garrick mentioned, one more weekend of official visits coming up. And so the work certainly not done for Ohio State. Braylon Womack's going to be on campus this weekend, another 5-star safety they're hoping to pair with their already committed 5-star safety, Blaine Bradford. And so a lot of work ahead for Ohio State this weekend with official visits coming up before recruiting goes into a dead period and things quiet down for a little bit. But there's certainly going to be plenty of commitments coming up the next few weeks before we really start getting into that ramp up to the football season, and Big Ten Media Day is just over a month away. And so we'll be covering all of that over on 11warriors.com, and we'll have more coverage here on 11 Warriors YouTube channel as Ohio State lands more commitments. For now, he's Garrett Hodge. I'm Dan Hope. This has been Press Coverage.